Well, welcome back. It sounds like you've made it to episode 2. We're here, episode 2. Who would have thought? If this is your first episode, go back and listen to Jerry McKaig's. It's fantastic. I know it's our first one, but it is a bloody brilliant episode. Check it out.
Only because of Jerry, not because of us.
Not because of it. No, that will become evident pretty quickly. Yeah. Go back and listen to it. Look, this is a fantastic episode coming up. Before we get into that, it was something I mentioned at the end of the first episode, and it's just how you can give us some help on iTunes. Just go on there, give us that 5-star review, and leave us a written review as well. That's going to help iTunes see that we're a podcast that's worth listening to, and it's going to recommend us to a whole lot more people. It will take no time to do, but it will mean the absolute world to us. So if you could do that, that'd be amazing. So yeah, this episode done.
This episode, we're really lucky to have had a chance to talk to Corinn Strating, who is a really beautiful lyrical flute player, as you'll hear.
Incredible.
And it took us many, many weeks to manage to kind of coordinate our schedules to get together, and we managed to record this at the Last Jar in Melbourne, and they've been a great supporter of us, actually, but we'll talk a bit more about that after. So one thing before this starts as well, so Corinn plays a tune at the beginning here called The Whistler at the Wake, and just take your time to really listen to this, and even, you know, when she finishes, just go back and listen to it again, because there's something about it that's just such a beautiful piece of music, beautifully played in a very noisy room, and it's just if you're wondering why we're doing this podcast, hearing Corinn play that tune, that's why we're doing this podcast. So off we go. Whistler at the Wake.
Yes.
Well, thanks, Corinn. That is a beautiful tune. Where did you come across that?
I learnt that tune when I was living in Galway. So I lived there for a while in 2005. And it was one of the tunes that was floating around there at the time.
It sounds very good with the accompaniment from downstairs. I should say we're sitting upstairs at the Last Jar in Melbourne. And it's student night downstairs, so we have a little kind of interesting accompaniment coming through the floor.
I think it's someone's birthday as well.
Yeah,
just getting that impression.
So what's your kind of origin story for this music? Like, where's the connection for you?
I think the connection probably is across a number of points, but I would say it started from growing up in a musical family. So certainly on my mum's side of the family, just about everyone plays music. So my granddad played music, and his whole family were musical, and music was a part of kind of daily life. So when the extended family was all together, we would always sing songs after dinner. That was kind of just part of the routine. And there's a couple of songs like that. We'd always sing this one particular song that my granddad had learned out of some songbook, that we always sang that as sort of like a thank you to the chefs, or a thank you to whoever did the dishes. So that was it was just a normal thing. And my parents also started a folk club when I was, I think it was the year I was born, actually. I don't remember life without the folk club, so that was always there. And so the first Sunday of every month, the folk club would be on, and they'd have artists from all around the world would come and perform. And, you know, I'd lie on the floor near the front and just kind of soak it up.
That must be the way to do it, right?
Yeah, well, I
what
think...
sort of drew them to that? Because I think about a folk club, and I think about that notion of having music around all the time, and it's beautiful. Yeah. But I also think then a folk club is like a lot of work. What moved them to do that?
Well, I think that the family's also very community minded. It's kind of a really important thing for all of us. You know, it's about kind of building communities and connecting people. So I think that was probably part of it too, that they really wanted to bring people together, and they loved music, and it sort of seemed like a good thing to do. And it was also that it's in country Victoria. So
yeah, whereabouts?
So well, the folk club happened in the Tyers Hall. So Tyers is a really little town, sort of on the edge of the Latrobe Valley. But I grew up in Traralgon, which is a bigger town, and it was people from kind of all across the valley and other parts of Gippsland would come. And lots of people got involved in the club as well. So I don't think it was a hard undertaking. It wasn't a big challenge because people wanted to start something and get involved. And so all Mum and Dad had to really do, I think they sent out a newsletter the first one was like, who wants to come along and be part of this music club? And everyone wanted to be part of it. So it wasn't that hard.
Which presents a problem in itself, I guess.
Yes, yeah, it can do. Yeah. But it was such a good place to grow up, I think.
And did all of you take all of the children? How many's in your family? Children?
So I've got my twin sister, and we've got a younger brother.
Right, and so all three of you took to it, because I've played a bit of music with your brother, and he's a lovely fiddle player. Yeah,
but I'd say it probably took him. It didn't take him longer to take to it because he always played music. But I think for me and my sister Nicola, music was just always a priority and present in our lives. Whereas perhaps for him, he was really sporty, so he had these other interests and would do these other things. Whereas for us, our whole kind of friendship group revolved around playing tunes together.
Right, yeah. Are there, when you're talking about acts coming to the folk club, are there particular people who you remember seeing and thinking, blowing your mind kind of thing? Yeah,
yep, there's quite a few, but I think probably there's one that I remember really clearly, and that is Andy Irvine. So I remember the first time he came to the club, and I think the first time he came to the club I was really little, and I don't remember that one so much, but then I remember being a little bit older and him coming, and I was sort of old enough and I was interested in the music enough to have this sense that this was like an important person who was coming here. And then when I was 13, so I went to school in Melbourne. I went to a music school in Melbourne at the VCA secondary school. So I was catching the train up every Monday morning. I'd get on the train and go to school, and then stay in Melbourne during the week. Anyway, this whole thing had happened for Andy. So he was on his way to the club, and he had a car, and the automatic gearing had stopped working. He's written a song about it since. Oh, wow. But anyway, his car, he basically kind of ended up having to reverse into Traralgon because no other gears would work on the car or something. And then he caught the train back to Melbourne with me on Monday morning, and we had this great conversation, and it was kind of totally life-changing for me because he's just kind of, he was describing his life and talking about how amazing being able to travel around and play music was, and the kind of connections he made with people through music as well. Yeah. And I was like, that's so cool.
So there's a couple of things about that, which the reason I sort of choked in my pint there was we were driving down in the car, and Darren was saying, okay, so Corinn is quite cool, so like lay off on the Planksty reference, just lay off and here you go with Andy Irvine. So so it's funny as well because you know what Andy Irvine's song O'Donoghue's? Yes. Which is an amazing song, and it's this encapsulation of a moment in time in Dublin when he realised this is kind of what I want to do, right? And it's a beautiful notion to think of you guys on the train and that kind of switching to you and something happening to you that's a sort of
And then when I went to Dublin when I was 21. And I was going over with my sister to go and live in Ireland for a little while and learn as much of the music as we could. And the first session we got asked to kind of fill in for someone was in O'Donoghue's in Dublin. And I was like, this is O'Donoghue's. That's pretty cool as well.
What's the name of the tune that he wrote about the with the car?
I can't remember what the name of it is. It might come to me, but yeah, it's it's a comedy, really. It's a song about, and I think it might have been that he'd had the same experience a couple of times, but anyway, that was one of them. He was trying to get to play at the Gippsland Acoustic Music Club, and the gears stopped working, the transmission stopped working on the car.
So that's funny. So there's a moment for you.
Yeah.
What happens next?
After that conversation with Andy.
This conversation with Andy.
Look, I suppose there were a few things that happened. So one was, I grew up going to folk festivals as well, obviously, and it's part of the process. And I remember going, it was maybe that same year or the year after. It was around about the same time. And we were at the Melbourne Folk Festival. And I was just starting to kind of really get into Irish music and starting to understand what my parents had been going on about for so long. I mean, because it had always been part of my life, but I think, you take it for granted when you're a kid, and then you sort of hit your teens and you start realising that maybe you can own it for yourself. Maybe this can be part of my identity. And so I was kind of just at that point. And so at Melbourne Folk Festival, and some friends who were also in the Gippsland Acoustic Music Club, so adult friends, I could see them talking to this teenager who looked about my age, right? And and she was wearing a Spiderbait t-shirt, and they were like, pretty cool band at the time. And I'm kind of going, oh, who are Ken and Julie talking to? I could see this person. She looked pretty cool. She's wearing a t-shirt of a band that I liked, and which was like, kind of cool as well, because I'm at a folk festival and someone's wearing this kind of, grunge, 90s grunge band t-shirt. Anyway, it turned out that was my friend Kat, and so I didn't know her then. They introduced me to her, and she lived in Mildura, and her parents had also started a sort of folk club kind of thing and ran a festival up there, and she played the fiddle. So we met each other at Melbourne Folk Festival and kind of shyly played the few tunes that we knew together. And then I don't think this would happen anymore, but we became like pen pals. And so because we lived, on opposite sides of the state, and so we started sending each other mixtapes of basically taping off our parents' vinyl and stuff, and it would be like all Planksty and Silly Sisters and all that kind of folk revival stuff. And we'd write out tunes that we'd learnt and send them to each other, and so we're kind of sharing the music that way. And I think connecting with someone who was my age, who was interested in and sort of exploring the music at the same time, was really important. If that hadn't happened,
it's invaluable. Because that would have just sent you on that. The tingles go off when you kind of once you meet that like-minded same age.
Yeah, I mean, I have my twin sister, so I can't be. I did already have someone, but I think to have someone else who wasn't in my family and who I could connect with was really important. Yeah.
So let's have another tune. Is there a tune that kind of from that period, or who?
Well, there's a tune, and I was just trying to remember it. So there's a tune that Kat wrote around that time, but the question is going to be whether I can remember it, because I haven't played it for a long time. But if I can't think of that, I can think of another one. Okay.
beekeeper. So what's Kat's full name, just so we give her full credit?
Kat Moser.
Kat Moser. Okay, beautiful. So what's the flute you're playing?
This is a flute that was made by a friend of mine, Michael Grinter. So Mike was from Chewton in central Victoria, and started off as a recorder maker actually, and then over the years sort of branched out into making flutes for Irish music, and very quickly became one of the best makers in the world. And it's not just me saying that. There's lots of big names and great players who play Mike's flutes and love them. So yeah.
What is it that you look for in an instrument? So I know of him and his reputation. What is it that really makes those?
That's a great question. I mean, I suppose for me, because I knew Mike my whole life, and so there was probably never any question about what flute I would play.
How did you know him? Did you just know him through the scene?
Yeah, just sort of through the music scene. I remember, like, he used to perform a little bit as well, and I remember him coming and playing down at the music club, and he was also involved in helping run a few kind of events around the place, like the Chewton Folk Festival that has now become Newstead, but he sort of helped out when it was at Chewton. And so I just kind of always knew him. And so it's hard to say whether I would have played a different kind of flute if I had have had the opportunity to play a different kind of flute. But growing up in rural Victoria, there weren't too many Irish flutes around. So knowing someone who made them was that was really the only exposure I had to them. So but I mean, like, what I would look for in a flute now is, this is a flute that has kind of a narrower bore, and it's perhaps takes a bit less air than some of the, you can get these big, the Pratt & copies have got big holes, and it's a much more open bore, and so the flute players that kind of tend to have that really powerful kind of huffy sound often, or just a really big tone, often they'll be playing a Pratt & copy, but they take a lot of air. So whereas these ones, I feel like you can get a very focused sound, and I like that about them. I like that you can sort of get this a round kind of tone quality to it, that without kind of having to, you don't sacrifice the tone to get a big sound, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Are there moments when you're playing where you're just like, where you can feel that in the instrument? You're just like, this is just like I don't know if it's the elasticity that it gives you, or just the way that it fits you, and all those kind of things that sort of combine.
Yeah, and I think as well, I mean, the thing about the flute, I remember when I was a kid, and my parents got a copy of that album, Music at Matt Malloy's, that one, they record the session. I mean, that's just such a iconic album. And that was probably around about that time that I was starting to get into tunes. And I remember reading there's heaps of liner notes in there, and all these descriptions of the session and the different people that come in and out in the recording process. And I remember reading it, and I think it might have been Peter Horan, or anyway, one of these great flute players is talking about how temperamental the flute is, and like some days you pick it up and it just sounds amazing and you've got it, like it's just there, and other days you pick it up and it's like you've never played the flute before, like there's no sound coming out, and it just and it is a little bit like that, that, and I mean, I think everyone has that experience with music. There are some days where you just feel connected to it, and it's almost like there's no barrier between your mind and the instrument. And then other days you're like, why is this so hard?
Yeah, it's a bit like having children. There's some days where you're like, these are the most amazing, unfolding, mysterious creatures in the universe, and there's other days where you're like, who are
Why?
these?
Like, did I make you?
It's kind of So, and both of them are equally beautiful manifestations of life and being human and being in the world, But it's like, and I do, I love that notion of the changeability of your relationship with the instrument from one day to the next, and it seems like that's like such an intrinsic part of the human experience of making music, right?
So what other instruments do you play? You play flute?
Well, I'd say the flute's my main instrument, and then I can sort of play, I dabble in a few other instruments, and don't necessarily say that I play them. I can scratch away on the fiddle a little bit, which I mostly do in the privacy of my own home. But every now and then, if there's a really big old time session, I might feel brave enough to bring it out again. And I play a bit of guitar, and I play in this band Honeyfields with my sister Nicola and Kat, who I was just talking about earlier. And I might play a bit of guitar on some of the songs in that, but I rarely do that on my own. Like usually I would have either Kat or Nicola is also playing guitar, or Nicola plays bouzouki, so there's another stringed instrument for me to kind of hide behind.
You mentioned old time, and I suppose it's definitely something I'm interested in, being a 5-string player. Like I'm trying to dip my toe in playing Irish, and obviously the 5-string is not the instrument for it, but persevere anyway. What would you say are the major differences? Because I think for a novice, someone who doesn't know any different, looking at both genres, you might kind of just put them in one barrel and say, yeah, they're the same thing. You straddle both, or have straddled both. What are some of the major call-outs that you kind of say, well, look, I find these are the differences? Maybe from a musicality point of view being one point, but also a cultural...
Yeah, I mean, I think from a musical perspective... I mean, it's just those classic things, like I'd say the rhythm's very different, so that you might even have the same tune that's played in both traditions, but just the way that you would approach it musically with old time, the rhythm will be different. It's perhaps a squarer rhythm.
Can you give me an example of that? I mean, I'm putting you on the spot here, and I don't know if you can, but like...
there is a tune that I just thought of, and I was just talking about music and Matt Malloy's, and there's a tune that's on that is played in both traditions, and in the Irish tradition it's called the Pigtown Reel, I'm pretty sure, and in old time I think it's called Wild Horses. I might have that wrong.
I've heard it as the Pigtown Reel in old time as well.
Yes,
so
I think it does get called yeah. But anyway, so I'll see if I can remember it, and I'll try and do. It's hard as well because, like, obviously a big difference would be that you would almost never play old time music on the flute, like ever. Like it's because old time music is string band music, so it's like all strings, and so sometimes people say to me like, just like bring your flute out, and I just couldn't bring myself to play flute in an old time session ever because it's hard to get it to sound right, but it also just
it's part of the, like, even you're saying, like, people within the community would say play. And even for a banjo player, yes, there's banjo in Irish music, but because it's a different banjo, and as you said, the rhythms are different. I was just at a session last Saturday, and it was a fiddle player. He's an Irish fiddle player, and he came along. And as far as I could tell, he was well versed as an Irish fiddle player, and he was sitting in an old time jam, and he was just barely keeping his head above water. And I was for me, I had a bit of a, what is it? Why do we think it's so similar, but it's so different?
They're not the same.
No.
I guess that's just...
And I could just play the start of this tune, I suppose, just to try and demonstrate it, because I think it does sort of sound different. But so for the Irish version... something like that. And then let's see if I can do an old time kind of version of it. It's going to be hard. I think we would have a lot less ornamentation, so it'd be like... I still did a couple of little cuts in there. It's hard to play the flute without doing that. I'm not sure if that demonstrates it accurately, but it's just sort of that. I think it's the old time versions are generally pared back a bit. They have a lot less ornamentation generally, although some old time styles, because I think that's the thing, it's the same as Irish music, isn't it? Like you've got this whole massive country and area of the country, and depending on where you are, people are going to play a different way. So there are some quite florid old time styles, but I'd say generally it's kind of pared back a bit. The rhythm's a bit squarer.
It's interesting as well, like the notions of rhythm, the idea that a rhythm within a session can be, and within a set of tunes in a session can be elastic, or less elastic, I guess. You know, I mean, that's really fascinating. And the other, oh, sorry, the other notion about so Darren took me to a bluegrass festival. I'm rubbing my head as I think about this. It was great. It was great. It was actually fantastic.
Best weekend.
And I'd never been to a bluegrass festival before. It was a bluegrass old time festival, and the old timey sessions were like a whole other animal, right?
Yeah.
They're massive, and a set goes on for 15 minutes.
Yeah, well, and I think this thing that's like, it's not even a set, so they'll just play one tune, and it's almost, you get sort of into this meditative zone, I find, you know, because you're playing this one tune for 20 minutes sometimes.
It's like saying the rosary.
But it's actually, it's a really different way of connecting with the tune. I think is like to play the same tune with so many other people for so long, and it's really different to how.
It's a very different social experience.
Yes.
Yeah. I do love that, and I do love the notion of like what happens when you take Irish tunes and do that with Irish tunes, and like how does that change them, and how does that.
And I think, I mean, it does happen sometimes. Like I've been, particularly at festivals, you know, you go to the National Folk Festival in Canberra and end up in this session with, you know, 20 people, and the energy is just there. Like it's everyone's primed for it. There's just this really good energy. There's a group of people in the middle that are really tearing into it, and everyone else is kind of joining them. And you might play a tune for a really long time, and so it does happen sometimes in Irish music, but I think it's just not as common. And certainly, like the way I would play most of the time in sessions is with a small session with maybe 3 or 4 people, and you play the tunes like 3 or 4 times each. And it's a very different energy to it, but it's still great.
Yeah.
I suppose we're lucky in Australia to that extent, because you have all these smaller musical genres that get lumped in together. So often you have the bluegrass with old time, with Celtic, and it's all in that field. So these lovely things can happen and come out of it.
Yeah, and they sort of that instrumental folk music that they just put
them
all together.
You're all the same. Yeah. So, and tell us about your time in Ireland. So you went over there just for the music?
Yep. Yeah. So when I was about to turn 16, Mum and Dad took the whole family over to Ireland, and we were there for, I don't know, a couple of weeks or something, and went to the Willie Clancy Week, did the classes there. That was sort of, you know, again, just building on that enthusiasm for the music. And so then when I was older, I really wanted to go back and just spend that time, and heaps of my mates who I was playing music, so by the time I got to kind of 18, 19, I was hanging out in Melbourne with a lot of other people my age who also played tunes. I found this whole kind of crew of people that were weirdos like me, you know. And
tell us about that. Like what?
Well, yeah, that was just amazing, you know. Like I could never have, growing up in Traralgon, could never have believed that there was this kind of, that could ever happen, you know, that I could have a group of friends that all played the same music as me. And
how did it happen? Was it through uni, or was it
no, that was just through folk festivals and that kind of thing. So like everyone had just sort of connected over the years, and then so I'd been going to school in Melbourne but wasn't really connected with the Irish music scene here until I was in my late teens. And then I met a fella called Ben Stevenson who plays in a band called Trouble in the Kitchen. And it just, so I was going to school at the Victorian College of the Arts secondary school, and it just happened that at that time Ben was studying film at the VCA as well. So we'd met at a folk festival or a music camp or something like that, and sort of discovered that we're both at the VCA, and he was just sort of getting into the flute at that time as well. And Benno's just like an absolutely outstanding musician. I mean, you probably heard him play now, but because he plays guitar with a few outfits, and he's also playing flute with Trouble in the Kitchen, and yeah, he's amazing. And so I was just really lucky because we were studying in the same place, and we'd sort of meet up after school, and he'd teach me all these tunes on the flute. And he was really kind of my first flute teacher, you know, even though I'd been playing the flute for years, but I'd been playing classical flute and other bits and pieces. And so then I suddenly had this person who could show me how to do the proper ornamentation and was teaching me tunes. And so then I'd say Benno then kind of connected me to a whole bunch of other people who were all living in Melbourne, and like, you know, it's like, because they were all a couple of years older than me. They're all already kind of in these established share houses and like staying up all night playing tunes. And
so where was the scene? Like,
it was mostly up around kind of Northcote, Brunswick, Northcote up there. And so then when I finished secondary school and my sister moved up to Melbourne and we got a share house ourselves and kind of joined that scene and had a few kind of golden years of just, yeah.
Is that scene still, is there still a seam of that?
Yeah, look, I'd say it's still there. I mean, there's definitely a younger generation that's also kind of
taking on the
doing
reins
it.
for you.
Yeah, like they're doing the all-nighters now because I can't do that anymore. But like, we're obviously all still mates, but it's that ebb and flow. People move away, everyone has kids and things kind of change, but we all still play music together when we can. And those connections are still there, like those friendships that you make through music, I think, are always... they've got this other layer to them, don't they? It's not just kind of like someone that you just know and chat to because you're connected in this sort of almost deeper way because you've been able to play music together and share that. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we can either go back and I'll ask you more about Ireland, or if there's a tune from the Melbourne days or something around there we could grab.
Oh, you look at my list. What have I got from the
What's on your
Melbourne?
list? Yeah.
Oh, they were just sort of tunes I was thinking of that I quite like, but what's a really Melbourne-y one? Oh, actually, so I'm not actually playing any tunes off the list because I'm thinking of all these other ones that... so there's one that everyone always used to play all the time back in those days, which I think is still a pretty popular session tune, called Tom Ward's Downfall. So maybe I'll play that one, if I can think of it. Do you want me to play a little bit first?
Beautiful.
Yeah, so that's a Melbourne classic.
That's a Melbourne
even though
classic.
it's actually, from Ireland.
Yeah.
So that was a tune you would just be at every session back in that.
Yeah, back in those days, all the time. I mean, we wouldn't play it that often now, and that's the way of things, isn't it?
All right. So what brings tunes kind of in on the tide and then out again? How does that happen? Is there?
Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch of factors.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I think I was just saying to you before we started recording that a couple of mates of ours have just come back from living in Ireland for a year, and I think those kind of things, like they probably bring a tune in, and it might be one that we all used to play years ago, and suddenly someone reminds you of it. A new album comes out and it's got a tune on it, and so sometimes there's kind of new tunes that are coming in that you haven't heard before, and then other times it might be one that you've just sort of completely forgotten about. And I think the other thing is just sometimes something random will happen, like this conversation that we're having today, and these tunes pop into your head because someone said something that reminds you of someone that reminds you of something else. And and I think when that happens as well, like I'll go to the session on Friday night and I might play a tune that no one's played for a few years, and then we might, that'll remind someone else of it, and then they'll play it next week, and then it comes back in because everyone's kind of got it back on in their head again.
I love that notion of tunes almost as being vehicles for time travel. They're just like
totally.
It's kind of awesome.
Yeah, and that's what I one of the great things about playing in a session, isn't it? That someone will play a tune that you might not have thought of for a while, and as soon as you hear it, it's kind of like a smell. You know, it takes you right back to maybe where you first heard it or first learnt it.
Yeah. That's your line, Dom. You're always
Yeah,
talking
I
about the
know.
smell of
Well,
music.
that's
Yeah.
kind of that was my experience. So we're in the last jar, and as I was saying to you before we started, in trying to reacquaint myself with playing and reacquaint myself with Irish music, I started coming to the session here on a Wednesday night, and sitting in the corner quietly and just listening. And I can remember as clearly as anything, just sitting and feeling almost like I was 16 again. Like, partly just because I recognised the tunes, but I also, even beyond the specific tunes, I recognised the sort of the ambience, the sound, the kind of acoustic of this music in a place with drinking going on and stuff. And then also I had this also personal feeling of like, oh my God, I sort of half know a fragment of that tune that it's kind of flying away in the wind, you know.
Just to get some perspective, how long had you not been in that environment? So when you're in America, how long you worked in those environments?
I didn't really play much in Scotland either when I was living there. So it was probably about 15 years since I'd played for, you know, in bands and stuff and things.
So that's a good time travel. It's a good time travel.
Yeah.
Like I just said, it is that emotion.
Oh, the wasted years.
You've so many more to waste. Don't worry.
So yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
anyway, so I probably went on a bit long there about that, but it was it was intense. Like, you know.
Yeah.
So take us to Ireland. You went over there.
Oh yeah.
Was that
Got
with
distracted.
the my fault? Was that something you went over to, like a course or to go to college, or you go and live and actually just try and play as much as you could?
Yeah. So what it was so I had this crew of mates in Australia that I was playing tunes with, and a number of them had this experience of going and living in Ireland for a while and just being immersed in the music, and like all you do is like eat, sleep and breathe music, and probably pints as well, but mostly music. And so me and my sister thought, I want to do that. That sounds pretty good. So we both finished studying. Oh no, maybe Nicola wasn't finished. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I was finished studying. That's the important thing. In 2004. So then 2005, we thought, right, let's go. And we had some mates who'd spent time in Ennis, but we also had a really good friend who spent time in Galway, and she was like, you got to go to Galway. It's a place to go. And some other, there were some sisters from Galway who'd been, well, actually they were originally from Milltown, living in Galway, had spent a year or two in Melbourne as well. So we had sort of some connections in Galway and thought, all right, that might be a good place to go and play a few tunes and, you know, see what we can do. And so we flew over and we landed in Dublin because we had a friend there that we could stay with for a little while. And so we landed in Dublin and met some people on the first day or the second day, and they were like, they're all musicians. They said, we've got these mates in Galway who are looking for, they've got a spare room if you want to move in. So we're like, oh yeah, sweet, that sounds pretty good. And it turned out that, and it was very lucky because the landlord was Mary Shannon, who's a banjo player. She's Sharon Shannon's sister, and she ran a session every Wednesday, I think it was in those days, in Coley's, Ticoli in Galway. And then one of the people living in the house was a fiddle maker and player, Paul Bradley, who's just he's a fantastic fiddle player. And so we were so lucky because Paul just was like, he was very generous. You know, he'd sit down and play tunes with us. He'd bring us in to play a tune. If he couldn't run a session, he'd get us to do it. Introduced us to all these other people who were playing. And so even though, we had a couple of connections in Galway already, but then we just had this kind of in with...
You've been very lucky with the people you just ran into.
Yeah. So
Fantastic.
So we were so lucky to have that connection with Paul because he taught us a lot about music. And
you were plugged straight into the scene.
Yeah.
I know you already had people there, but...
Yeah, but we were kind of... Because I think it can be hard going over as an Australian and kind of being like, hey, mate, do you mind if I come and play a couple of tunes? And you can just sort of see the fear in everyone's eyes, which is sort of understandable because it's become like this sort of music tourist destination, and people do kind of lob in with no idea about kind of how to be respectful in a session, you know, like it's kind of I'm just going to sit down and play a million tunes. And yeah, anyway, so we were really lucky because it meant that we could sort of overcome our Australianness a little bit and not have to spend a lot of anxiety and energy and time kind of proving ourselves. We could just sort of be there and learn straight away, which was really lucky.
Is there a name for that? Like going to Mecca? Is there a nickname for people going?
The pilgrimage.
Yeah, I'm sure there is. Just I haven't heard it yet.
Yeah, because I mean, like a lot of people. I mean, obviously, there's people all around the world who play Irish music, and everyone wants to go to Ireland and learn how to play it.
It's such a common story.
Yeah.
People.
But what do you like? Aside from the frequency of sessions and the availability of good players, I mean, what do you get out of that? Like, when you come back to Australia, what's changed for you from seeing and hearing the music in situ, where it comes from?
That's an excellent
If anything.
question. Yeah, I mean, no, I think a lot does change, you know, and I think perhaps, well, I mean, there's quite a few things. One really tangible one for me was that perhaps before I went, I loved playing like those kind of funky new tunes that were like, you know, there's all these kind of like flashy bands that were coming over to Australia, and you'd like learn, like, you know, Flute or whoever, and you like learn all their tunes, and everyone was playing those tunes. And interestingly, in Galway, a lot of people did play those tunes in the sessions, but by the time I got home, I kind of hated those tunes, and like all I wanted to play were kind of those beautiful old tunes that are simple and don't have syncopated beats and aren't kind of trying to be flashy. And so I don't know what it was about being in Ireland that made me appreciate those a bit more. Perhaps just hearing them played so well everywhere, you know. But by the time I left, I was fully sold on the trad rather than the new trad. Yeah.
I find that my uncle plays a button key accordion. I refer to him often in this. He played in a cultist group in our town since about 1979. Like, he never missed a Thursday night, you know. And I would occasionally come back from university and go and play, and he would always be like, yeah, play too bloody fast, you know, too fast, the rhythms are too stretchy, whatever. And it's taken me till now to really appreciate what he's getting at. But maybe that just comes with age, you know. You kind of you want to kind of fuck about with stuff when you're young, and then you realize that actually the source is kind of is where it's at.
Yeah, and I think that is part of it. And you know, in terms of the other stuff that you maybe bring back or just absorb, I think it's perhaps like a little bit about how, like, connecting with other people through music. Like, not that we weren't doing that already, but it's perhaps you start to appreciate different aspects of that. And
so one question then would be, like, you know, in the sort of I was about to say something that made me sound very old there, like, in this crazy world we live in with all the internet technology, like, what's the point of going to Ireland? Like, I mean, you've just answered that, but still, like, everything is available.
Yeah, although, you know, like in 2005, there was no social media, and we didn't have the internet in our house, and, you know, I think we had one of those phone card things, because like mobile phones kind of weren't. I mean, they were mobile phones existed, but they weren't kind of the way they are now. There were no smartphones, and so I think that it did feel a lot further away, even then. Like, you know, 2005 doesn't seem like that long ago, but actually, it was a while ago, and I think, we didn't have the same ways of connecting with it. But I think also just like being there and being present, and being surrounded by people that it's just like it's been part of their life since they were conceived, really, you know, like it's a very different thing.
I think you can only get a diluted, like, in this net day and age where we are now, with the internet and everything, it can only be a diluted version, because you would end up getting a fragment from here, a fragment from there, and then you're going to sew together this tapestry of what you think it is. It's almost like a version of what it might be, whereas you, as close as you can get to the source, that's what you're taking with you.
Yeah, and, you know, like I think it's also like, and this story is going to lose a little bit of meaning because I can't remember who said it, but there was like some philosopher or someone who talked about art, and I think it was about paintings in particular, and that photographs of paintings kind of, each photograph of a painting detracted from the essence of the painting. And I think it's kind of like that, that like you can hear something through speakers, or you can experience it through a screen, but it's not actually the same as connecting with it in a physical space, and connecting with, like, musically connecting with that person who was also playing music.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So where's music now in your life, right?
It occupies a very different place in my life, because it used to be like my entire life. It was just like 100% music. Now I work full time and I cycle a lot and I do like other things, but it's still obviously really important to me. And so I suppose now, like, I try and play most Fridays, and if I don't get to, like, I notice that, I notice that when I come back to it, it's harder. I feel like I don't feel that same ease with it. And so I try and play most Fridays in the session at the Drunken Poet, and then I try and get along to festivals where I can as well. But festivals these days, because I'm also getting old, they're invariably disappointing. It's like, the sessions just aren't as good, and like, you just can't find the space to get that golden moment of a tune that you're looking for. And so really the ones that I love are like, every now and then someone might sort of invite everyone around to play some tunes in the living room, and you've got sort of 4 people sitting around just playing tunes in a quiet space. And you're like,
perfect size for a
this is what
festival.
it's all about. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, do you want to do another tune? Well,
Sure.
and I have another question for you after this. But
Okay. What about, I'll play a classic flute tune. So this, when I was younger and I was first getting introduced to the tunes, there's a fellow called Andy Rigby who's been around the kind of Melbourne, or the Australian scene for a long time. Anyway, Andy gave me a tape that he'd recorded when he was in Ireland, of a bunch of flute players playing at Joseph McDermott's wake. And Joseph McDermott was a very well-known flute player from Sligo, I think. And anyway, this is a tune that Joseph McDermott wrote, and it was on that tape. I learned it off. Anyway, I'll just play the tune. We'll just call it Joseph McDermott's. How about that?
I know that playing on your own is kind of funny, given that we've just been talking about what a social experience playing music is, but it is so lovely to be able to hear you playing on your own. It's so beautiful.
Thank you.
So, Corinn, thank you so much.
Yes,
My
thank you.
pleasure. My pleasure.
Fantastic.
Well,
That brings a tear to my eye. Actual cheers. These are actual tears.
oh, thank you.
Real tears. And it's only episode 2.
Yeah, I wish it meant something getting tears from Dom. As you'll find, he tees up at the.
I am a crier.
He is a crier, which
Yeah.
is a lovely thing. I'm a cold-hearted
It's cold as ice. Yeah, you are.
I'm not really.
Yeah. So thanks very much to Corinn for that. I mean, there's no, thanks isn't a big enough. That was awesome. And thanks also to the last jar and to Chris Fitzgerald, who've been a great supporter of this podcast from day one and given us space there to record, and just generally being very welcoming and very accommodating. So Chris and Jody and everyone there has been fantastic. So
yeah, you should check out their. They've got 2 great sessions which happen, well, a minimum of 2, Wednesday nights and Sunday nights. So if you're ever in Melbourne, check out the Last Jar, because they're honestly brilliant sessions.
So before we go on, as you may know, the early days of a podcast like this, it's like when you put a baby out on a mountainside. Or, well, not that I've done that.
Yeah, babies on how many mountains?
But at this point, the most valuable thing you can give us is a good 5-star review, even if you think, you know, the
Just
musicians are worth 5 stars, but those 2 maybe 1.5. You know, go for it. Give it a 5-star review and a couple of words in the review.
Yeah. Give us the 5-star review. Tell us to F off in the written part, but just give us the actual 5 stars.
Brilliant, and that'll be brilliant. That does something to elevate us in the from the great morass of other podcasts. So that would be fantastic, and that would be lovely, almost as lovely as just getting a chance to talk to these musicians.
Yeah, and look, don't be afraid to share us around your friends too. Like, I honestly think this podcast, the community itself, it's built on community. Like, word of mouth is the thing which is going to make this thing a success. Like, Facebook and all that stuff is one thing. That's great. Share away. But if you know someone that you think will like it and you're sitting having a beer or a coffee, mention it to them. Because I know if Dom, if you mention it to me, I'd be straight on it because you took the time to mention it to me. So yeah, look, tell someone.
Yeah. All right.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Hi, my name is Rosa. I'm gonna eat an apple. Please give Dominic and Darren 5 stars. Thank you.